Let's get the view now of Wits University African Center for the Study of the United States Director, Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. A very good evening to you, Professor. Grateful for your time, as always. So the leader of the EFF, we also heard from the SACP yesterday, this call for the expulsion of U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Briggity. Is that the right decision at this point?
You know, Malema's position is out there in the public. I think I've read the reports of people wanting very drastic reaction on the South African part. But I think my immediate response is that the EFF is not part of the ruling coalition, and therefore it is unlikely that that kind of decision will be taken very seriously at the level of government. And because largely the government has taken the approach, which essentially amounts to the same thing, is that the ambassador was off the line, and he should have used better language, he should have used better diplomatic channels, and therefore the matter for now, I think, is going to be de-escalated because the two partners really want to work together on other things rather than being distracted by the allegations about the Russian ship and its arms sales. Yes.
Is this the sort of allegation, though, that will continue to linger, perhaps even for years to come, especially while we wait for that inquiry to begin and bring us some sort of finding, because we don't know yet who would have placed those South African weapons allegedly on a vessel meant for Russia?
You see, that issue is going to linger, and you are correct about that, because I think now we are just in a standing kind of mode. The need to de-escalate the problem was partly the appointment of the inquiry led by an independent judge. But as of now, we don't really know when that inquiry will conclude, and therefore what kind of results or information it will come up with and recommendations. So we are not out of the woods yet, if we could put it that way. But I think the war of words have somewhat declined, and I think it was important that over the weekend that the issue be eased a bit. And then the inquiry is the important element at this point. And there have been reports that the U.S. probably would provide evidence to the inquiry, I think from the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godwana, speaking today, talking about he doesn't think that the U.S. will impose sanctions, and this matter will be studied, and all the information will be provided to the panel. And down the road, then things will be okay. That was his reading of the problem.
Right. And on the conduct of the ambassador, we're hearing that there's been an apology given to the South African government. He's not disputed it, but people are saying, well, they'd love to hear that apology pronounced coming out of the mouth of Ambassador Briggity. Do you think the Americans would go as far as compelling their ambassador to make a public apology, given that when he spoke at that briefing on Thursday, he said he would bet his life on the credibility of the information that they have that South Africa allegedly armed Russia to help in the fight against Ukraine?
I think an apology has been made and the apology has been accepted, but I can understand why some other people would prefer that the U.S. government officially apologizes, but I think the ambassador is the representative of the government here, so if he apologizes, that is taken as a government position on this issue. Mm-hmm. So, but I can see why people would be interested in getting the ambassador out, pushing for a much more explicit apology from the U.S. government.
And it's important to note that these weren't just views that the ambassador drew out of thin air, because in the subsequent State Department briefing in Washington on Thursday night American time, that was repeated, and they very much echoed what the ambassador had said. So it is a view that holds even within the higher-ups, within the U.S. Diplomatic circles, and that it was also discussed by South Africa's confirmation in a trip that was taken by a delegation from this country to meet with senior American officials recently. But I want to ask you about reports tonight that are being attributed to Russian media that a South African military delegation is currently there to discuss issues relating to military cooperation and interaction. How does that now fit into the broader picture? Will it feed into the claims by the Americans?
I think it's going to fuel the claims by the Americans that South Africa is not non-aligned, despite the claims here that, and the president was saying today, that South Africa wants to remain non-aligned. But I think the linkages on the military side appear to be pushing the idea of a non-aligned very, very, very far off the mark. So if it is true that, in fact, there is a delegation already in Moscow, that I think is going to contribute to the animosities between the U.S. and South Africa, pending the recommendations of the panel, or the inquiry from the panel.
What then needs to happen in the interim? How does South Africa manage this non-aligned position when all three countries, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, appear to be friendly nations, yet here we are trying to navigate what is, by any measure, a very complex relationship?
But it's also a very complex issue because non-alignment theoretically means that countries are not aligned to any of the positions of the big powers. And that is what it was in the 60s and 70s. But there are fewer countries actually that had relations, military relations with the U.S., even though they claimed that they were non-aligned. So this could be a continuation of that pattern of some countries actually doing things that are not clearly non-aligned, but their broader position, their broader policies to be non-aligned.
Is South Africa really non-aligned?
I think what South Africa should do is to explain precisely what it means by non-alignment, because some people have raised issues. For instance, at the UN, when it comes to votes on Palestine, South Africa consistently votes against the U.S. But when it comes to Russia, it abstains. When Russia-Ukraine matter, it abstains. So it needs to put very clearly what the definition of non-alignment is, particularly as now it engages with the Chinese and with the Russians, particularly on the military side. So it's that we need some clarity there, and maybe the U.S. can get some reassurance that South Africa remains a friend of the West, if we could put it that way.
And just on that, I wonder if it's possible to be friends with both sides and be as loyal and as committed to each relationship, because this weekend we saw two conversations happen back to back. President Ramaphosa had a phone conversation with Russia's Vladimir Putin. He then spoke to Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky the next day. And Zelensky, in speaking in Rome over the weekend, said that one of the things that he basically asked Ramaphosa to do is to further agitate for peace since the Russian invasion of his country. Is there even a serious role for South Africa to play at this moment? Non-alignment is not very difficult to be non-aligned. You can talk to both powers, you can be friends, but you define the lines, you define the limits. I think as to whether South Africa could mediate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, that was something that was expected from the beginning, because there are very good relations between the two previously, Ukraine and Russia and South Africa. So South Africa was perceived initially, when the conflict started, as a very natural mediator. But I don't know at this stage whether in fact that is possible. Although you can't rule it out. I think particularly if the Ukrainians push the idea that South Africa remains a country with considerable moral power, and it also has good relations with Russia, it potentially can then step in even at the last moment
even at this very, very difficult moment of the conflict.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Gilbert Khadiagala. Always a pleasure to speak to you.